Unstabilized approaches are a key contributor to accidents on non-precision approaches, according to the NTSB and the FAA. It is really important to figure out your descent prior to the actual descent so you can use time as a friend instead as an enemy, which is what most sim pilots fail at. So in this video, we're going to see how to execute one step by step using quick formulas that will save you from an unknown outcome during your descent. So let's begin with the first step, which is prior planning. This is the most important one. If you don't plan before the top of descent, you'll get into trouble, and there's no other way unless there's some sort of miracle, but that is 30 minutes before if you're a beginner or an amateur, or 15 to 20 minutes before the top of descent if you're more experienced, mostly with the aircraft or also in general, but it's mostly with the aircraft. It is really important, and you'll get to know this with experience. If you find that 30 minutes is too much, well, you can or subtract it to 20 or 15, even 10 minutes before, depending on the simplicity of the aircraft. But that's another story. The most important thing is that you need to plan before. For the planning, there are some important aspects that you need to consider. The first and a really important one is the descent angle. Most pilots, if not all of them, descend at 3 degrees. There are some exceptions, but the key is a 3-degree descent path, which means you have to figure out the distance of the top of descent from the airport or a certain fix, and the feet per minute which you need to descend. You also need to check the aerodrome charts, which Jepson has them, and if you have Nevergraph, well, that is great. You need to use it, and you also need the airspace You also need to check the airspace regulations. You need to know. This is really important, guys. The ground speed is totally different from the airspeed. Airspeed is the speed of the aircraft relative to the air, while the ground speed is the speed of the aircraft relative to the ground. This is not necessary when you're doing performance tricks such as the landing or anything, but during descent you need to take into account the ground speed, because that is where you're going to land. You're going to land at the ground, not in the air. And you also need to check the airport weather, especially the current wind, which is what makes you decide the runways, which I've already talked about earlier. But there's also another reason, which I'll explain later, but you just mostly need to know if it's a tailwind or a headwind. So how do you figure out those aspects, and how do you keep the most important numbers? Well, there are many formulas, and this one that I'm going to talk about is one that is really commonly used many pilots use it with many aircraft, and it is subtracting your current altitude with the planned altitude, whether if it's the airport altitude or the fixed altitude, and you multiply the result by 3, and that result you divided by 1,000. It is pretty straightforward. You can even do it in your head. You can also add if there's a tailwind and subtract if there's a headwind. Now this is where we come into the explanation of this, and because through a tailwind, what makes you do is that you just go faster when you go through a tailwind, and that actually speeds you up relative to the ground. Relative to the air is the same, but relative to the ground, it is you go faster, which is why you need to add some nautical miles in order to reach your planned altitude and on time, and also subtract a few miles. Doesn't have to be that much if there's a headwind, and also depends on the strength of each of the winds. Now, if you want an example, there's the formula in in the screen, and there's also the numbers, which if you're at 15,000 feet and you want to go to 5,000, and you just subtract those two numbers and you get 10,000 feet. You need to descend 10,000 feet. You multiply it by 3 and you get 30,000, and you divide it by 1,000 and you get 30. That number is that is a distance from the fix or the airport at which you need to start descending. That is the top of descent distance, and it is measured in nautical miles. Be careful with that, nautical miles instead of regular miles or kilometers. It is nautical miles. So this was a formula of calculating the distance from the fix for the top of descent distance from the fix. And there's also another formula that you just basically multiply your ground speed by 5, and it's pretty simple. What you need to know is that it calculates the descent profile, the descent speed, and a 3-degree glide path. If you're going at 120 knots, you just multiply by 5, and you get 600. It is 600 feet per minute that you need to descend. And if you're going at 150 knots, ground speed, honestly, you'll get 750 feet per minute. It is pretty straightforward, and there's not much thinking, and it is pretty standard. And honestly, that is if you take into account that you're going to descend at a 3-degree glide path. So you're now starting your descent, and everything is going to plan. That you just need to make sure about that the runway you're about to land is in use. You also need to figure out, the landing weights and all that stuff that makes the aircraft more complicated or anything. And those calculations are then to be needed. And then you just go to the approach. Now this one is a little more complicated, but you just need to follow this rule, the 60-to-1 rule. It's a ratio, and it basically means that, because you have to understand that in 1 knot, if you go at a speed of 1 knot ground speed, you'll go 1 nautical mile in 1 hour. So this means that if you go at 60 knots, you'll go at 1 nautical mile in 1 minute. It is pretty straightforward. It is simple math, but let's make a scenario which can complicate things, but in the end it is quite simple if you know the experience. So you're coming from 5,000 feet, you're going to 2,000 feet and 500 feet per minute at 90 knots. How many miles away you have to plan your top of descent? In other words, how many miles away you need to start your descent? Well, first you need to know how much altitude you're going to descend, which in total is 3,000 feet. 5,000 minus 2,000 feet. And you also need to calculate how much time you need to descend. So because if you have the 500 feet per minute, then you can now divide 3,000 feet by 500 feet per minute. It'll take 6 minutes. And therefore, if you have the speed at 90 knots, therefore you can calculate how many miles per minute you can go, which 90 knots divided by 60 knots, which 60 knots is 1 mile per minute, you'll get 1.5 miles per minute. And so with using that, you can now calculate the top descent distance, which you just multiply 1.5 times 6, and that is 9 nautical miles away from the fix. That is the distance of the top descent. And you can also add a couple miles for anticipation. It is really important, and especially if you're in a tailwind. Now let's do this descent in the descent scenario. This one's different. Descending from 10,000 feet to 5,000 feet in 10 nautical miles at 120 knots. How many feet per minute should you be descending? Now the altitude you need to lose is 5,000 feet. There's a subtraction. Since you already have the speed, which is 120 knots, ground speed, you just divide it by 60 knots, which is equivalent to 1 mile per minute, and you get 2. You are going 2 nautical miles per minute, and since you already got the amount of nautical miles you need to start descending, you just divide the 10, which is the amount, 10 divided by 2, and you get 5 minutes. It'll take 5 minutes to perform the descent, and therefore you can now calculate the vertical speed in feet per minute, which is now 5,000 feet divided by 5 minutes, which is now 1,000 feet per minute. 1,000 feet per minute, you'll go from one fix to another. From that point at the top of descent to the actual destination of the fix, and right on time, which is why you need to add a couple hundred feet per minute for anticipation, because you don't want to, I already arrived on that fix, and now I need to start descending at 3,000 feet. So now what? It is too soon. You need to add some anticipation, and also for your aircraft to stabilize itself more efficiently during the descent phase. Now this is the final trick. It's not really a trick, and it's not even a formula. It's just a table that is included in the chart. It is called continuous descent on final approach. It is very briefly, and it is very simple, and it is located on every approach chart, whether it is precision or non-precision. And because it first tells you the angle, the descent angle at which you need to be descending, and if it's a precision approach, the glide slope, and then there's a table of the descent speed with the the descent speed with the feet per minute, the vertical speed. It is pretty simple, because for example, if you're going at 60 knots, it tells you how much you need to be descending, the rate of descent at a 3-degree glide path. I don't know the answer, but it is included in the charts. And that is the same for 70 knots, 80 knots, and also if it's a big airport, it includes 180 knots, 150 knots, those large speeds that are built for airliners, and also some big general aviation aircraft. So there are too many formulas, I understand, and especially if you're not good at math, but you have to understand that you have to practice these, and especially if you're in a small aircraft, because airliners do this automatically. They calculate the top of descent using the constraints, also the wind, and also the runway you're going to land at, and using tons of stuff, such even the weight of the aircraft. Because there's so many sensors in the aircraft that are captured by the computer, and it automatically calculates it. Even if it's an Airbus or Boeing, it is pretty simple. But you need to understand them, because there are sometimes that the computers aren't exactly perfect. And yes, but basically, even though if it does that for you, you need to plan ahead. It takes practice, because there are times that you think that the top of the descent is too far away, but then you make a recalculation, or then you just wake up and then, oh no, it's about to descend, and it is quite stressful at the beginning, but you'll get used to it. Especially if you're a beginner and then you're constantly gathering experiences, you'll get used to it. It is not that hard if you're a more experienced pilot. So basically, just plan ahead, just do all those calculations, and as many as you think it is necessary, even if it's calculations on the weight of the aircraft, which is really necessary for the landing, and also the weather and all that stuff you need to check. So just plan ahead, and this is it. Thank you so much for watching, and happy flying.